To say writing is a process may be saying the obvious, but it's one of the most important concepts and strategies a writer can learn to be successful. Writing is a process. It's something like many things that involves a construction sequence, but for me, I like to think of the writing process as an inquiry process. Because as we write, we discover not just what we truly mean, but how best to say it. So there are many perceptions of the writing process, or we might say misperceptions. So we'll talk about some of these first. One of them is that if I just follow all the steps in the proper sequence, then I come out with a good paper. It's this idea that writing happens in a linear fashion, kind of like a paint by numbers picture. Another misperception is writers start writing when they have everything figured out. In other words, you can't really start writing till you have everything figured out. Another one is the genius fallacy, that some got it and I don't. A lot of people perceive their ability to write as something that's almost genetic, like their hair color. Another one is that when you write, you should get it correct the first time. This may come from standardized testing where you're doing one-shot writing. But there's a lot of pressure on being able to just zip out something that's perfect. Another one is that good grammar is equivalent to good writing. And then the corollary of that is that if you have trouble with grammar, that means you're a bad writer. And also there's the lone wolf syndrome. As a writer, you need to go off and fight your dragons all on your own, and that writing is a very solitary activity. So the reality is that rather than writing being a linear thing that happens in a nice paint-by-numbers sequence, that writing is really dynamic. It's a dynamic, organic act, and it's definitely not linear. And perhaps this linear perception of writing comes from textbooks and posters on walls that present this 1, 2, 3, 4. And, as teachers try to explain this complex process, they try to simplify it and help people learn it. And hence we get this idea that it happens in nice, neat steps. Also, this notion that you have to have everything figured out before you start is a fallacy. Writers don't have to have it all figured out when they start. In fact, it's one of the best things to do is to actually start writing, because you figure out really what you mean to say as you write. And with the genius fallacy, writing, like many other things, is a skill and craft that can be developed. If you perceive yourself as a poor writer and there's nothing you can do about it, this kind of fixed mentality will really harm you. And I encourage you to have this more growth mentality, that as you put effort and as you work on things, you can get better at writing. And the heavy pressure on first drafts is unrealistic. No writer gets his or her text right the first time. It takes many cycles of adjusting, adding, trimming, fixing to get it right. And although good grammar is important, of course, we value that because that's how we understand and don't avoid misreadings. But there's a lot more to writing than simple grammatical correctness. That's actually one of the easiest things. How do you really address an audience? How do you structure something? How do you appeal to an audience? What sort of choices are you making about the details and the evidence you're using? All those things are really important too. And in terms of the lone wolf syndrome, hopefully you'll find that writing really happens much better within a social context, within a community, that writers often rely on ideas and help from others, sharing their drafts, looking at other people's ideas and thoughts to help them write. So rather than writing being linear, we can say that writing is recursive. And what recursive means, and that diagram is a pretty good diagram to kind of illustrate, is that writing really happens in these kind of cycles and embedded activities that repeat. So it jumps ahead and jumps back. So rather than phases or rather than stages, perhaps we can say they're phases. There's certain activities that we do and orchestrate, and we repeat those activities multiple times as we write. Planning, coming up with ideas and how to do something, how to solve a particular problem. We may repeat that mental activity of generating ideas multiple times. Proofreading, editing, we might write our first sentence and correct a misspelled word. Well, that's supposed to come at the very end, and here we're doing it in the very beginning. So this notion is that writing happens in a very recursive way. So we still have this notion that writing happens in a linear way. And I think that because writing happens in time, that I think that there is a sense of beginning, middle, and end, and certain activities we do more productively at different times. Like, brainstorming, we tend to do a lot of that early on. Well, let's think for a second about where writer's block comes from. And if you've ever experienced writer's block, you know that you really can get stuck, and it's very frustrating. So Peter Elbow talks about when we're writing, we're really doing two things. In one sense, we're being creative. Those words weren't on the page, and now they are. We've created those words. But also, we're being critical at the same time. There's this voice in our head, perhaps a ghost of some past 7th grade teacher saying you're not going to do it correct, or you're a bad writer, or whatever it might be. And what happens is that it's very hard to be creative while we're being critical. That critical voice tends to cancel out the creative, and hence we're stuck. So what Peter Elbow talks about to avoid writer's block, and here's how we can kind of broadly perceive the writing process, is to separate out the creative and the critical, so that we spend time in what we might call a creative phase, where we're not overly concerned with correctness. It really doesn't help to edit closely and worry about grammar in a first draft. But likewise, in a final draft, it's not productive for us to ignore issues of grammar and punctuation and things like that in a final draft. So it's kind of like they balance each other and help each other out. At a certain point, you're going to want to put on your critical cap and ask those tough questions about correctness. Is this addressing the task? Is it structured clearly? Do I have adequate support? Have I spelled everything correctly? Whatever those critical questions are of correctness. But we don't want to be burdened by those too early, or they really do shut down our writing. So here's a kind of rough list of the kind of creative activities and the critical activities. And these things, there's other names and there's probably more, so it's just a kind of rough list. All right, let's talk about a couple of other views of the writing process and perspectives that are important. One of them comes from research in the 1970s and 80s into the cognitive view of writing. And these researchers said that writing is really best understood as a set of distinctive thinking processes which writers orchestrate or organize during the act of composing. So it's what's happening in your head that's most important. And in particular, they noticed this notion of goal-directed thinking. The act of composing itself is a goal-directed thinking process guided by the writer's own growing network of goals. One goal leads to another goal and a sub-goal, and part of it is encountering these problems and how you're going to accomplish the goal. The act of developing and refining one's goals is not limited to the pre-writing stage, but is bound up with the ongoing moment-to-moment composing process. We're constantly this is coming from the work of Flower and Hayes, we're constantly generating and evaluating, this kind of back and forth. And there's that kind of creative critical going on. We're constantly doing that as we move forward and set new goals as we write. They also stressed problems and about problem solving. And if you think about it, people only solve the problems they define for themselves. So writing, part of developing your ability as a writer is to understand the kind of complex series of problems that writing calls on you to solve. How do I create an engaging opener? How can I make my support in this paragraph stronger? How can I get the documentation correct? These sort of high-level questions and problems to solve are very much part of being successful with your writing. Here's Flower and Hayes' model, which I'm not going to kind of dive into and explain a whole lot. I'm just showing it for kind of interest. So another really important thing about the writing process is having a firm understanding of the writing situation. And studies have shown that the most important and crucial important step in the composing process is to analyze and define your writing situation. And in its biggest, broadest sense is these three components. What do I want to say? What's my message? In essays, that'll be your thesis. Who do I want to say it to? Who's my audience? And why do I want to say it to them? What's my purpose? What do I want to achieve towards my audience with my message? And the time you spend figuring out this writing situation and your rhetorical stance within it is time well spent. So here are a couple other images. This is Canavy's communication triangle between the writer, the reader, the topics of the world, and the message in the middle, surrounded by the social context. And this is Mike Palmquist's view of the writing situation, which is a little bit broader. But notice that writers are on one side with their influences, purposes, and interpretations of the reader. And the readers are on the other side of this exchange with their own influences, purposes, and their interpretations of the writer. And there in the center is the document, the text in quotation marks. This exchange is influenced by genre. So, and surrounded by various levels of context. So I really like this complex view of this relationship between the writer and the reader within the writing situation. Here's my own image of the elements of rhetorical stance. And the writer needs to really balance and align all of these to be productive. The assignment constraints, the genre, the occasion or situation, the purpose for the communication, the knowledge that the writer has, their relationship with the audience, their text on the page and what they've actually written and what's in their head, the production process, the genre, and the list could probably go on, but those are some strong elements. It's really difficult to write and to orchestrate and align and manage all these elements. Going along with this is perhaps seeing writing as an event. It's a fruitful way of conceiving writing, an event or occasion. It happens in a particular occasion and place before others who are listening and who can respond. Writing then is a form of dialogue and communication within this context. Of course, what makes this hard is that often as writers, this audience and this occasion is something we have to imagine because it's not necessarily physically present to us, like when we go somewhere and we meet people. But still, this is a very, very good way of thinking about writing. Now, Donald Murray was a great teacher of writing, and he's got a few elements about the writing process that I like. I kind of call it the Lego construction view of the writing process. And the first stage that he talked about was to collect. Effective writing is produced from an abundance of specific information. The writer needs an inventory of facts, observations, details, images, quotations, statistics, all sorts of forms of information from which to choose when building an effective piece of writing. So part of the big thing to do early in your creation phase, you might say, is to kind of gather data. Get all those pieces in your Lego box. The more you've got in there, the more choices and the better you're going to be able to make some kind of construction. And one thing that Murray believes strongly, and I do too, that information breeds ideas. Specifics make contact with each other and become an idea. 2 and 2 in writing adds up to 7. So as you collect these details and then you begin to go through them to think how you might use them, you get new ideas and you see new connections. Murray was also big on the planning phase. The most important writing usually takes place before there is writing, at least what we usually think of as writing, like the writing of a draft. And a lot of testing, playing, experimenting, sketching, designing, outlining. Nancy Atwell called this writing off the page, and there's lots of ways to do it, but this kind of trying things out before you really dive in, designing what you're going to do, can make a big difference. And then developing, and that probably is our traditional notion of drafting, when the writer's vision confronts the reality of the page, carrying out and writing the plan that's developed. And this diagram from Bereder and Scaramandeglia, I think, captures that difficulty in what's going on as the writer's vision, that's the content space, what do I mean, confronts the reality of the text, which they call the rhetorical space, what do I say? And there's a kind of constant back and forth as we try to match or fulfill what we really mean on the page with what we're actually saying. So to kind of wrap up, there's 3 things I think to consider when considering a piece of writing, whether it's really successful or not. Does it work? And the first thing is, has it achieved its desired effect on the intended audience? That is the primary question. If you want the writer to laugh, do they laugh? If you've written a grant seeking funds, do you get the grant and you get the funds? If you've written a job letter and you're trying to get an interview, do you get the interview? So has it achieved its desired effect on the intended audience? And the second is it true? And I don't necessarily mean even fiction, this encompasses fiction, but is it credible? Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? This goes to, in a sense, the reader believes what you're writing. It doesn't necessarily, I'm thinking in fiction terms, have to be fact, but the reader is drawn into the world and believes it. But in other kinds of writing, of course, we definitely want to have our facts straight. But this goes to trustworthiness with your reader. They don't trust you. If they're not buying what you're saying, they won't buy it. They won't keep reading. They won't believe. And then thirdly, is it correct? Now, I don't want to diminish grammatical correctness and all that kind of stuff. It's essential, but it's not necessarily the most important thing. And one thing you'll find is that as you work harder to achieve your desired effect on your intended audience, you're going to work harder to make sure it's correct. Like my wife, when she's viewing resumes, and a resume is a document, the desired effect is to try to get the job. And she sees that there are a lot of grammatical errors in the resume, she pitches it. So that has gotten in the way of them achieving their desired effect. But keeping that higher goal will drive you to do the other 2. So I think that concludes this PowerPoint, this video on the writing process. A little bit long, but I hope it's been helpful.